Of all the Eurozone countries in crisis, Ireland is the least known. The coverage of this important country in the Eurozone is virtually non-existent in the global media. But those following what happens in the country are moderately optimistic, because despite the reports in the financial press in particular, which suggests that Ireland is a successful model, this is not the case. The fact is that Ireland has the most venal mainstream politicians I can think of, belonging to every single mainstream party in that country. And this venality and corruption has created a political crisis and a social crisis. With me today is Paul Murphy, a socialist member of the Irish Parliament. We're very happy to have him here, and his electoral victory was the product of participation in important social struggles and opposition to the mainstream, both in Ireland and in Europe. Paul, welcome. Very glad to have you with us. Just tell me, in your words, what is happening to Irish politics? The image presented is by the politicians themselves in your country, the ruling politicians and their supporters elsewhere. Look at us, we've been good, we've done everything the Troika asked us to do, we followed their instructions, and now we've recovered, the crisis is over.
Exactly. So it's the big lie that the Irish political establishment collaborates in, but also the European Commission and the Troika collaborate in, because it works for all of them. So the Irish political establishment gets a pat on the back for their great success of austerity, but also then the Troika uses Ireland falsely as a success story to beat the people in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal with. The reality is very different. So you do have quite impressive headline growth rates at the moment that are massively distorted because of the distorting role of multinationals using Ireland as a base for effectively tax avoidance, but also the nature of this recovery. I mean, really, you have a recovery for the very rich. The 300 richest have gone from 50 billion to 84 billion in wealth.
Another thing that people don't talk about is the high level of emigration from Ireland. I mean, emigration on this scale, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we have not seen for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the historic escape valve for the capitalist class in Ireland to kind of release the pressure in society by getting the young people who have expectations, who want a better life, who could fight for a better life, instead to leave. So, I mean, 1 in 4 young people have left the country throughout the course of the crisis. I mean, it serves a purpose for the establishment. It brings down the unemployment figures. So the unemployment figures are dropping, and more of it has to do with emigration than it has to do with job creation. And that is definitely an historic strategy of the ruling class.
Paul, take me through the political structure of Ireland. Because of the Irish national struggle, a number of political parties still operating were formed effectively in the 20s. For the benefit of our viewers who might not know this, just take us through them.
Yeah, okay. So the two biggest parties in Ireland historically are both parties of what would be called the centre-right. They're openly right-wing parties. Fianna Fáil, which was the historic biggest party of Irish capitalism, which did have more than the next one, a connection with the working class and a certain base in the working class, a certain populist approach. Fine Gael is the party historically of the big farmers, the big capitalists, etc., also a centre-right, in reality right-wing party. And then we had the Labour Party, which was very much the third party. Labour never developed as a kind of mass social democratic party like existed in other countries in Europe, because of effectively at the time of the struggle against British imperialism, leaving it to nationalists as opposed to saying that now was a question of social struggle. So it never developed for that and other reasons in terms of urbanisation. It was like a 2.5 party system. And then the fourth party is Sinn Féin.
But that's more recent.
which is more recent. And reality comes from the 70s, a split within the Republican movement where it's effectively the provisional IRA was a right split from the Republican movement.
I understand the class difference between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. What are the political differences between them? Could they merge?
Yeah,
Why don't they merge?
The political differences are almost nothing, and have been almost nothing
For a long
for
time.
a long, long time, since the Civil War. In reality, the end of the Civil War, where they were on opposite sides. So right now, Fianna Fáil, which is in opposition, the government is Fine Gael and Labour. Fianna Fáil tries to position itself marginally to the left of Fine Gael, but it doesn't have a resonance. And I mean, an important political development was the elections in 2011, which was the first general elections in the course of the crisis, where Fianna Fáil was decimated. I mean, they lost all but one of their seats in the capital city, and then subsequently lost that. And they just suffered a massive drop, and like an historic connection that existed between significant layers of working class people, smaller farmers, etc., and Fianna Fáil was severed. And so, I mean, they're trying to recover, but it's clear that there's now a ceiling on the recovery that they can have. And it's part of, I think Ireland now is more part of the European political picture, or the peripheral picture in Europe, in terms of a certain crisis of representation for the capitalist class, where in the European elections, the combined vote of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour was just less than 50%, which historically it would have been 85, 90%, and it shows that the space that now exists in politics.
Before we go on to discuss what is happening now, the other big change which I detect in Irish politics, one of the constant complaints of the left was the dominant stranglehold position of the Catholic Church in not allowing any social reforms, some which they still resist, but Ireland has changed despite that. And this church and state relationship in Ireland is probably was much more intense than in Italy even, which is the country where the Vatican is. How do you explain the persistence of this through time immemorial?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's one of the key contradictions within Ireland, is the still dominant role of the church in terms of state structures and a very, very close connection. And effectively, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael both rested on the church throughout all their times in power as an instrument of social control, and also as a way of avoiding providing public services, whereby still 95% of our primary schools for young children, are run by the church. Nearly all of the hospitals are run by the church. Most of the secondary schools are run by the church.
To this day?
To this day. They're like outsourced by the state to the church. The state, taxpayers, pay for the wages of the teachers, etc. But the church controls the schools, controls the board of management. You'd normally have the local priest will be on the board. And it was a way of, the state not providing public services by giving it to the church, but then also quite a significant instrument of social control of people. And the issue is that still exists formally. They still have this control, but society has moved on so much. You have this urbanization, people moving to the left, moving to positions of progress, and it's reflected on a whole then range of issues. I mean, we had in the course of the last year a referendum on same-sex marriage, which was carried.
No, I know, it was amazing.
Exactly. And it exposed the fact that, the political establishment in Ireland, including the Labour Party, they hide behind the notion of a conservative social majority that's out there, a silent majority that does not exist, right? Now, there's huge pressure on the next key question of oppression in Ireland, which is abortion rights. I mean, Ireland has one of the most restrictive abortion regimes in the world. In the Constitution, the life of a woman and the life of a fetus are put on a par, which means it's completely illegal. People can go to jail. There's huge pressure.
With tragic results, as we've seen.
The key thing is that, like with the death of Savita Halappanavar, which was really horrific, it exposed to people that's what this means. The consequence is that, yes, I mean, thousands of women travel abroad every year for abortions, but those that can't, because of their status, if they're asylum seekers, etc., those that can't afford to, then are faced with real massive crises in their lives and a potential huge danger to their lives and to their health. And so there's been a whole number of cases which have exposed this reality and have created a big movement where, now there is an annual March for Choice, which has 10,000 people. There's a big majority in Ireland for a significant liberalisation of the abortion regime, of taking that out of the Constitution, and there's almost a majority for what we would stand for, which is for abortion rights provided through the health service.
Is a referendum on this not possible?
That's what the fight is for.
A referendum.
A referendum, that's what's necessary, unfortunately.
Exactly.
It shouldn't be necessary, but it has to be taken out of the Constitution.
Yeah.
What will happen, though, is that all the political parties of the establishment will play with it, where the Labour Party, although they've been in government now for almost 5 years, says that they'll stand on an election manifesto of calling for a referendum. But then they say it's not a red line issue for them. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, which are conservative, they're opposed to a debate on this issue in society, and they'll try and block it. And I mean, there's rightly a sense amongst the movements after the victory in the same-sex referendum that now we can have victories, but it would be a mistake to underestimate like how inherently conservative these forces are, and how you really need to develop such a movement from below to force them to. So I mean, we've been doing some, effectively civil disobedience, direct action through the distribution of abortion pills in Ireland, which are perfectly safe to use but are illegal, and we've been openly distributing them with public representatives, etc., for which they could face 12 years in prison. Oof. And the state has stepped back, which is interesting. They didn't intervene, and it's to expose like the hypocrisy of the establishment on the issue, to expose the fact that these things are available, you can get access to abortion pills, and to try to help them build a mass movement of protest and pressure to force a referendum on it.
The huge movement that erupted in Ireland over the last year and a half and took everyone by surprise, I think the scale of it probably even took the left by surprise who were behind it, was the movement against water privatization and the imposition of new controls and water meters. How did this movement develop?
Yeah, it's correct to say that nobody saw it coming. I think there's parallels definitely with like the US 1929 and the 30s, in the sense of a certain stunning effect of the crisis, a building up of resentment and anger over a whole period of years. It didn't go away just because people didn't feel they could do anything. It built up and built up. And then they announce a recovery that gives people confidence to lift their heads up to see what's happening. They realize it's a recovery for them, not for us. Then they impose another austerity tax, which is the water charges, and then it just explodes from below. And really, it is from below. I mean, there's no question that the left, the Anti-Austerity Alliance in particular, played a key leading role, and in terms of arguing in particular for non-payment, but it was spontaneous. I mean, hundreds of groups were formed across the country, local groups with different names, without the organisation of left activists, coming from below, using social media, organising in local communities, street meetings, etc. You have, new methods of organisation which didn't come from the left. A majority of society involved in civil disobedience. It's a scary thought, and it's transformed politics because it gave people a sense of their own power. It gave them back confidence. It pushed people to the left significantly. I mean, a very interesting survey was done of participants in the movement. A majority of people had never been on a protest before, and 1 in 3 said that they would vote for parties of the radical left, so the Anti-Austerity Alliance or People Before Profit, whereas only 1 in 4 said they'd vote for Sinn Féin, which would be bigger in an overall scale. And it shows that it was those that were connected to the movement, were calling for non-payment, were helping to organise, are those that people are now looking towards.
Did the lessons of the Bolivian movement in Cochabamba against water privatization, were these used in the campaign or not?
So they were somewhat injected and welcomedly injected by the left into the movement. It didn't come organically from people because it's the kind of thing. But I mean, it is, and it's one of the great things, and again, it's facilitated by social media, is the instinctive internationalism of people, where people are really welcoming when they find out there's a movement against water privatization in Greece or in Germany or Cochabamba in Bolivia. People know that they're part of a struggle against a worldwide 1% and a European elite in particular, and they're very welcoming of it. They want to learn the lessons of it, and they want to apply those lessons. So it's present.
This, of course, brings up the question of Sinn Féin, which opposed the water privatization and no doubt increased its popularity. And if the opinion polls are correct, the Labour Party in Ireland will be wiped out, just as it was in Scotland. Do you think the figures are accurate on this?
The question is the scale of the wipeout that Labour will suffer. I mean, now in a number of opinion polls, which is after a budget that was presented falsely in the media as a giveaway budget, they're on 7%, which would result in, well, because of our system, it's not clear how many seats that would result in, but it result in very few seats. It's reasonably likely that there'll be more TDs from the radical left in the next parliament than from the Labour Party, and the Labour Party could be reduced to really quite a small rump. And I mean, this is the process. Labour's done this before, okay? That's because they've always been the half party in a 2.5 party system. Even when it was a social democratic party, they would go into coalition with parties of the right.
Dick Spring did that.
Exactly. And every time there'd be a surge of opposition to Labour and opposition, they'd go into government and then they'd lose support. It's different now because they would then go into opposition and regain support over 1 or 2 parliamentary terms. Now the space is taken. It's taken by Sinn Féin
and
by
socialist left.
Exactly. That's the point. And so their ability to regain that base, it's just, I don't see it happening. And I think the Labour Party as a significant force in Ireland, or any sort of significant force in reality, is finished. I mean, in the Parliament, they're often more right-wing than Fine Gael. You know, they present themselves as a party of work in the most Thatcherite, you know, anti-unemployed way that is possible. I mean, really, it's disgusting.
I read that they show up at food banks and are very proud to be part of the food banks, not seeing that this is actually in itself pretty disgusting, that the country needs food banks.
I mean, it's one of these like amazingly sharp, you know, contrasts between Jeremy Corbyn, who made a famous speech talking about the tragedy that is food banks, what it says about a society that needs food banks, and Joan Burton, the Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, having a photo op, smiling, cutting the ribbon at a food bank. And it's just, you know, it's obviously mad politically, but it also shows just how disconnected they are from their traditional electoral base, which will be working class people. And it's the same process. It's the process of Pasocification that we saw in Greece, that these parties go into power, the crisis of capitalism is so deep, they all do the same thing, and the parties that are punished most is those that come from a social democratic position with more of a working class base, and they just devour their own base with the policies that they implement.
Now, Sinn Féin, of course, has emerged as a major political force in the politics of the Republic. And clearly their aim is to replace the Labour Party as a sort of soft social democratic party. But in terms of what they will do after the elections, we still don't know, because there are 2 possibilities here. One, they could approach the socialist left for some level of agreement, or they could turn to one of the old parties and say, okay, well, we are prepared to talk business with you guys. What is your estimate of what is going on in that organization?
The leadership of Sinn Féin is trying to ride 2 horses at once. They're under pressure from the left. There is the emergence of a definite space to the left of Sinn Féin as a result of the movement. I mean, I won my seat in a by-election where the Sinn Féin should have won it easily.
It was a safe Sinn Féin seat.
It should have been a safe Sinn Féin seat. So they made a series of mistakes and they were outflanked to their left, and that space has grown. So they're watching that space with concern, at the same time as also trying to manage an appeal to what they consider to be a skillful appeal to more middle-class voters, which means a toning down of the left Keynesian type rhetoric, exactly, and preparing for the potential for coalition with most likely Fianna Fáil and potentially Labour. I mean, if you have a troika party like Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael or Labour, they'll be in there to be the agents of the 1% to prevent any progressive change happening. I mean, the majority of Sinn Féin voters would like Sinn Féin to look towards the left as opposed to look towards the right. The election would be extremely complex, it's very polarised, and whether a stable government emerges is in question and is a problem from the point of view of the establishment in Ireland as well.
And what of the socialist left? Is it possible, do you think, in the near future to create some sort of umbrella organisation so that the left doesn't fight each other but has an agreement?
Yeah, so there are big opportunities. I mean, that space has now been created and can grow. There's obviously an intense competition, in particular in reality with Sinn Féin for that space, but it exists, and there also exists thousands of people who've been radicalised, who've turned towards the left, who are open to looking towards left-wing political ideas, who could be the basis of a new party. I think what we need is fundamentally a mass party, or an attempt to build a mass party of the left with different trends operating within it in a democratic and fraternal way. Where we currently are is that you have the Anti-Austerity Alliance, of which the Socialist Party is a part. It's probably the biggest organisation on the left, followed closely by People Before Profit, of which the SWP is a part. And so that's where we are, and I think we know where we want to go.
Yes.
And the question is how we get there. And what we've done, and I think it is significant, is that we've formed a bloc between the Anti-Austerity Alliance and People Before Profit, recognising the existence of two different organisations for the next elections and for the next parliamentary term. So that means that in the next elections, we will stand formally as the Anti-Austerity Alliance stroke People Before Profit and People Before Profit. In a number of
constituencies.
Exactly, and with the key target being to get 7 TDs elected. 7 is the magic number because if you get 7, you have a formal parliamentary grouping. It means you have the high-profile slots of leaders' questions every single day in the Dáil, which we rarely have at the moment. It means you have as much speaking time as the big parties.
Paul, what you're describing is both positive and in some ways astonishing, because in political times, which globally are very hostile to the left, you know, where we've had one defeat after the other, in Ireland, curiously, there was never a left party as such in the 20s or 30s, because the nationalists dominated that space so completely. So that was a time when communist parties, socialist parties, left groups were growing all over the world, but not in Ireland. Now we have the opposite, where left parties are on the decline in many parts of the world, but in Ireland a new space has been created. Would you explain this contradiction?
The fact that we didn't ever have a mass reformist or a mass, communist party in Ireland, it has negatives in terms of a lower level of generalised class consciousness than I'd say exists in Southern Europe or even exists in Britain. But it also has positives in the sense of a certain freshness and openness that exists.
It's a clean slate.
It's a clean slate. And the left that is being built is a left that's influenced by Trotskyist ideas, that is explicitly radical, anti-capitalist, socialist, and is based on the ideas of struggle. And it means that we can have, if we achieve the 7 TDs elected, which isn't just a parliamentarist, electoralist kind of, it's the idea of being linked to a movement, that can have a big impact. That'll be the first explicitly left of Labour, left grouping in the Dáil officially since the 80s, when the Workers' Party, which came from effectively a Stalinist tradition, would have had that, but then Stalinism collapsed, they went into crisis, it was in a negative time, whereas this is a time that is opening up for the left, where things are moving leftwards and there's more and more opportunities.
What is the situation in the North, where we have this strange situation where the British Labour Party doesn't exist as an organised force in the North? A, could you explain why that is? And B, what are the chances of something on the left emerging in the northern provinces too?
There was a Northern Ireland Labour Party historically, and then at a certain stage effectively made mistakes on the national question, which is the rock upon which left organisations became seen as a pro-unionist party in the north, and then collapsed. It wasn't able to maintain a base amongst both working class communities, Catholic and Protestant. Parties, the likes of the Labour Party, operate a hands-off policy. It's quite open. In the left, there are opportunities. For us, historically, the trade unions are even more central to the prospects of developing a movement for socialist change in the north than in other countries, because they're the organisations that bring together Catholics and Protestants. It's the only organisations that do it.
Has all talk of a united Ireland disappeared from the political space?
Well, there was actually an interesting opinion poll conducted by RTE and BBC about a week ago, which was about the question of a united Ireland, which revealed that a very small minority in the north wanted a united Ireland in the short term, and a minority in the south wanted a united Ireland in the short term. A majority in the south wanted it in the long term, within people's lifetimes, and still a minority in the north wanted it in the north, wanted it in their lifetimes. I mean, for most people, the reality is that it isn't a day-to-day burning question, and that's what the polls reflect.
What if Scotland over the next 5-10 years went independent? That would certainly have an effect on this, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it definitely would. I mean, the movement for Scottish independence is an overwhelmingly positive thing.
Yes.
And you see that, it's not just a movement for, it's not an abstract flag-waving nationalism.
No, it's not sectarian, it's
Yes.
not ethnic, it's a civic nationalism saying we want to determine what goes in this space.
Exactly, and implicitly linked to a rejection of, a Tory-dominated
Exactly.
Westminster, austerity, etc., and a view for a
Yeah.
more social Scotland or whatever.
Yeah.
And the effect in the north would be complex, because actually it would heighten the fears of Protestant people that this is heading towards inexorably towards the north breaking away from England and Wales and eventually a united Ireland, and could intensify sectarian division, which would be problematic.
Paul, lastly, how would you describe the bulk of the Irish media? Is there a single daily newspaper which could be described in the broadest possible sense as progressive?
No. There's nothing even approaching that, unfortunately.
No.
I mean, the media is dominated by one individual called Dennis O'Brien, who has a financial interest in the water charges and owns a lot of it. And then you have other media which is not controlled by him, but just echoes the establishment line. It is one of the very interesting consequences of the anti-water charges movement is the widespread exposure of the role of the media, whereby people see it. Because this guy, Dennis O'Brien, he encapsulates corporate, political, because he's connected to Fine Gael, and media interests, and encapsulates the 1% or an element of the indigenous 1% in Ireland, which is added to by the multinationals which are present in Ireland. And so people seeing that and then using alternative forms of media, in particular social media, is quite a progressive development. But I mean, you should see the way the media treats the left with just disdain. Exactly. It's just received common wisdom of the establishment.
It's like the treatment of Corbyn here, including by The Guardian.
Yes, exactly. And then that was one of the really interesting things that people see.
Yeah.
The role of, we don't even have a Guardian, but the role of a Guardian is actually as a gatekeeper of certain ideas and keeping things within safe. It's interesting because it's like that quote about first they ignore you, then they humiliate you, then they try to burn you. Because at the start of the process of the water charges, they saw this interesting process. Look, all this protest happening, because they'd kind of sneered at people for years and years that the Irish people aren't like the Greeks or the Spanish or the Portuguese. We don't protest, we just wait in the long grass for elections, And then there was this protest movement, and at first they treated it like an oddity, a strange curiosity. And then the movement developed, we got elected, non-payment became a clear call, there was protests, which, there's a famous protest against the Deputy Prime Minister, the leader of the Labour Party, which I was involved in, where her car was delayed for a few hours.
And they blew that up out of all proportion.
A massive media onslaught against us. I mean, I remember at one stage of that, the Sunday Independent, which is the main propaganda sheet of Dennis O'Brien, in the first 8 pages of the Sunday Independent, there was something like 10 articles attacking the Anti-Austerity Alliance and attacking me, and it's so blatant,
10 articles.
Something like that. I think it may have even been more.
Paul, just a last question. When are the next elections scheduled?
So they're likely to take place at the end of February or the start of March. At the very latest, they have to take place in April. It's clear that the government in particular is going to model its election campaign on the Tories in Britain. It's the notion of stability versus chaos, and we are the extreme bogeyman of chaos in the background that they try to use. It doesn't wash with people, because people don't have stability in their lives. They really don't. I mean, we've an epidemic of homelessness, an absolute crisis, thousands of people in horrific situations, epidemic of low pay, etc. But it plays to a certain base, so it'll be the most deeply polarized election campaign, and where they're trying to save their skin, because they're looking over the precipice of a majority engaging in civil disobedience, a rising of protest, a rise of the radical left, and they're concerned about what the future holds. And They're concerned about the rise of Sinn Féin, although I think fundamentally they don't have to be, because of historically where Sinn Féin comes from. There's just a lot of fear in the political establishment, and it's definitely reflected in the media establishment. So it'll be an election campaign like no other, and it will be the third historic election in a row, in the sense that we had 2011 when Fianna Fáil got hammered. Then you had the European elections where the Labour Party got wiped out in local and European elections, and now you have a situation where the most likely governments either contain the combined centre-right parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, which would be the first time ever, or contain Sinn Féin, which is also the first time ever. So it's likely that we'll have another, very significant historic election.
We'll follow it closely, Paul. Thanks very much for coming and participating in this conversation.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.